So today we're going to go over debouncing. Often when you do like a scrolling event, that's, that happens a lot. That event triggers quite often. You don't want to have to keep re-rendering the web page. That takes a lot of resources. So I'm making a new project. I'm going to call this my debounce, and that's what I call it. And let's add a new file in there. That's index.html, and I'm going to give it a basic. Let's load some JavaScript here. So I'll call it index.js. Fantastic. I'm going to add that in here. Script. Let's give it a source of index.js. And I'm going to defer this because I'm nice like that. And I will give it a little CSS, I suppose. Style.css. Okay, it's pretty basic stuff here. So I will give it the style. Yep. Okay, cool. So let's just make sure everything is running. Let's do a little console log. Blah. I always like to do this little quick check here. And let me open you up. So there we go. I have my blah. I'm going to zoom in on that. Okay. I have a little bit of cold, by the way, so hopefully my sound isn't too terrible. Okay, so we are loading our JavaScript. Everything works perfecto. All right, so the thing I want to kind of recreate here is this infinite scroll, or just a very big scroll, and then we can do the infinite thing later. All right, so I have content, I have scrolling. So if I were to normally have a scroll event, maybe let's say when I scroll, I want to, I don't know, change the color or something. I'm not quite sure exactly what I would want to do at this point. I'm just trying to do an example. But I would set up the document, add an event listener, and this is going to be on scroll. Oh, sorry, this is on the window, actually. The window is what's scrolling. Scroll. And so we can put a function in here. This is the callback. Oh. And so whatever goes in here is what gets triggered every time something happens. So I'll put an E in here. That's the event. And I can just right now console log the event just to show you what that is. So refresh. And when I scroll, this thing, it triggers very often. So instead of scrolling, I'll just scroll like testing or something. I can't spell anything. All right. So if I scroll, you see it keeps triggering, and it triggers a lot. So whatever I'm doing, I may not want it to have it trigger that frequently. Even though the scroll event is triggering frequently, I want to do what's called debouncing, and let's see what that looks like. So typically when you debounce, you will have so the way debounce works is it is a function that returns a function itself. So it's what's called a higher order function. Debounce, if I could spell it right. It takes a function, it takes some wait time, and it will return a function in the end. Okay. It will return a function, and that function is the callback function that we will be using. So it'll look something like this, where I have my debounced color change. It doesn't take any parameters, but you can imagine there being parameters in here, technically. And all I want to do is change the main's background. So actually, I'll just make a main here, get document dot. So I have that in memory, and I don't need to keep recalling it. So I'll just say main dot style. Maybe I could get a random color. Oop. Const random color. Something style dot background color equals this random color, and random color is going to be a I guess hexadecimal or something. RGB, and then put some random stuff in here. Okay, let's do that 3 times. And I'll just do I'll just make another function actually. Random color, random number actually. So this will return math.floor, math.random. So I'm using randomness. Times the number. And that'll just give you a number between 0 and that number. And in this case, I want to get a random number between 0 and 255. So that's all I'm doing here. Yep, it changed it to random color. So this is what's happening every single time. Okay, so, and it's possible that I don't want it to change every single time it does this. So if I were to provide this as an argument, as a callback here, that's sort of like the undebounce situation. So see, oh, that's, you're gonna get a seizure doing that, right? I just want it to be a very small change every like maybe 2 seconds or 1,000 milliseconds or some whatever it is. I want to debounce this thing. So how do I do that? Well, this thing isn't debounced technically, so I want to actually provide the color change. So I'm going to actually call it just color change. Let me change this up. So right now that's kind of like the bad situation where it will give you a seizure, right? I don't want to provide color change by itself as the argument here. Let me actually get rid of this. I actually want to debounce it. So let's call it the debounced color change. And that is going to equal to debounce given my callback function, which is called color change. And then some wait period, maybe it's like 1,000 milliseconds. So when I call debounce, I provide a function and a wait time. This function will be debounced, and I will get a function that's very similar, except it will not call itself more than once every 1,000 milliseconds. So right now we don't have much going on, but effectively we're taking advantage of namespacing and closure. So in here we can start kind of defining some things here. So first we can say, hey, we have a variable called timeout that isn't anything right now. So this is what we'll use this to trigger function. We're not defined. Okay. So within this namespace, timeout is defined. Within this function's namespace, I still have access to the timeout variable, even though outside of that I don't have access to it. And that's kind of like the trick of it. So what is timeout? So basically, if timeout doesn't exist, we can actually call the function, which is called func. Then we call the function. Well, I call it func. Oh, stop auto-completing. Okay, func. Call the function, and then we set our timeout to something, which is, in this case, this is set timeout. And we set timeout to literally do one thing and one thing only. And that is to remove itself, effectively. I can kind of do I can do arrow function here. So all it's doing is it is setting the timeout to null. So it's basically like removing itself. But while this set timeout has been defined here, you cannot use this function, or it won't be called, basically. And that's pretty much it. And if timeout is defined, then this doesn't do anything. And that is basically it. There are some considerations that I'll talk about in a second, but I want to see if this works. So let's go through the logic here. So I call debounce on color change. Color change comes in here as a function. Timeout is not defined. I return a function here. That means the next time that scroll happens, timeout is not defined. I go through this logic. Function is called, and then I set timeout here. Anytime I try and call this function again, though, because timeout is waiting before timeout is removed, then or set to null, this function, this logic will prevent the function from being called again. So that's how that works. So let's recall here and let's scroll. Okay, every 1 second, about every 1 second is triggering. So that is the basic debounce functionality. You may be curious about like arguments, for example. So in this case, if your function takes arguments, so let's say I have my color here as some like, red, and the red is supposed to be not random, but whatever the red number here was. Well, in that case, then you would have to provide that argument to the debounce function. maybe this is always 255. And so, well, how do I take into account those variables? Well, first you can recognize that this function, all functions by default, will have an arguments variable set up. That's like default. So there's like literally something called arguments, and it is an array of all the arguments that the function got. So you can actually use that when you call your function. So instead of calling your function, though, you want to call the .apply method. So it's literally just like that. Apply. You can refer to this as the context. So the context here is this function. So this, you say like this. And actually, I think that bears some consideration here. So context is that, and then you literally just apply the arguments. Arguments, and you use apply because apply uses an array for when it supplies its arguments. So that, I mean, it's just like another way of providing your own arguments later. So my reds should be mostly red looking, I think. So let me see if I got my color properly. Change color. See that it's 255 here, 255, everything's 255. Okay, perfect. So one thing I do notice is that it triggers sometimes like right away, right? It triggers sometimes right away. So the scroll event, interestingly, I'm curious about that actually. Let me see. That's interesting. So like the scroll event does trigger once on load apparently, because I guess it assumes. I think it's because I'm actually at the bottom. Is that right? Ah, I see. So that's interesting because it will, if I'm all the way at the top, it doesn't trigger. But if I scroll down even a little bit and I reset, technically like the window reloads and then it scrolls down and that triggers a scroll event. So that is something I just found out. So yay, good for me. You learn something every day. One thing you may want to trigger, and I think this is kind of common actually. So sometimes you want this thing to trigger right away. In this case, like I'm debouncing it in the kind of typical way that you would want. There is another way that you can think about how you want to debounce, because sometimes you just want it to trigger once and that's it. So you can debounce at the start when you first scroll, or you can wait until the end to trigger your event. So that's again, it changes like the logic of how you want to set things up. This is going to be like, I'm going to call this debounce once, basically. And I'm going to call that naming here and here. Okay. So debounce once. It takes another thing, which is like immediate. It's just a flag to see if it's immediate or not. So here I would say, when I create my debounce function, I will say false for a second. Okay. So how does this immediate work? So what's going to happen is I'm going to keep checking if I have my timeout, as well as whether it's immediate. And if it is immediate, then I'm okay triggering the set timeout properly. But the thing is, I need to abstract this this logic of when to reset the timeout to null. So I'm actually going to remove this and call it something else. Const reset timeout, like that. Okay. And in here we will have another functionality where I'm going to define it here. So no longer is this logic going to apply, because this is now not the same. So here I'm going to create a variable, which is like call now. And if the timeout doesn't exist and I have immediate triggered, then I know I can call the function now. And what that will look like is like if call now, then I can just call loop. Well, basically it's like this thing here, line 8 here. So if call now, then call the function and apply the arguments that you normally would. When I am scrolling, I actually want to prevent the timeout from working, because I want to wait to the very end. So I would actually clear the timeout. Just a clear timeout is just a function that removes the timeout, as long as you have a reference to it. In this case, it is the variable called timeout, conveniently. And basically, while I'm scrolling, it's going to keep clearing it until the very end. and that's allowing me to do the wait basically, and that's why I need to abstract this this logic here. So if it calls now, then I just like call now and that's it. That's done. It just gets called now. But if I want later, I will have a function that does exactly that, and I will call my reset timeout. And if immediate is false, that means you need to wait till the end, and that's why this is going to work this way. Then I call my function here. So I apply this arguments, and this is okay because I'm using the arrow function, and that's where I call later. Okay, so effectively, when later triggers, it's going to check this immediacy, and if it's set to true, then it won't even call the function because it's already been called here first initially. So let's save that. Let's run it, reset here, and when I scroll, so to note, it triggered once already because I'm at the bottom of my screen. So I will reset that, and it won't trigger anymore because I don't technically. The scroll event doesn't trigger. Now because my immediate is set to false here, it will trigger right away. Bam. Oh wait, what? Oh sorry, it's immediate set to false, so it does wait. False, true. Okay, so it triggers once, and it triggers at the end of my scroll, and given the wait time, of course. Now, if I provide it true here, then it would. I want to reset here. Let me go to the top here. Reset, and the second I scroll, it'll call here on line 14. See, and I scroll, and immediately it changes color, and I let go. Nothing happens because when the set timeout triggers, it checks for immediacy, and if it it's set to true, so this actually doesn't happen. I gotta go. I got some people here. Hopefully this was helpful. Let me know in the comments. Make sure to subscribe, like, all that good stuff. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.